Recording started.
There were a couple things that I wanted to finish up with fundamentalism as it's developing, because I think that's an important background or foundational aspect to this. Remember, a lot of this is stemming from a division that's happening in evangelical Protestantism in general in the United States, and that's reflected in the Restoration movement as well to some extent. And that largely starts as a response to the liberal views of the Bible that kind of denied biblical inspiration, that it challenged the traditional notions of how the biblical texts were constructed. And so you have that on one hand, and then the rise of Darwin and Darwinian science. On the other hand, those two things kind of working together led to some people accepting that, some people rejecting that. We talked in the 19th century about some of that. We're seeing now the 20th century this kind of conservative response to that, an attempt to try to reassert the traditional views of the Bible's inspiration, particularly a lot of it focused on issues related to Genesis and the origins of human beings, because essentially what you have in the late 19th century is a two-pronged attack on Genesis. On one hand, you have the questions about the authorship of the book, challenging the traditional notion that Moses was responsible for Genesis through Deuteronomy, claiming that they were a composition of time, as well as claiming that they were influenced by other ancient Near East texts, particularly Babylonian epics. And then, of course, you have the challenge of Darwin on Genesis and the historicity of particularly those first 11 chapters. And so a lot of the focus from these conservatives that will become fundamentalists was on attempting to rehabilitate the biblical view, largely because that had been the focus. And so we were looking at how fundamentalism here is developing, and specifically thinking about fundamentalism in the context of a 20th century American Christian, American conservative Protestant movement. Now, today we use fundamentalism to refer to a wide variety of religious groups or positions. So we can talk about Islamic fundamentalism. There's even Hindu and Jewish fundamentalism. Probably in some respects you could even point to Buddhist fundamentalism. But then, of course, you have fundamentalism as a term being applied in politics and other spheres outside the religious. But it's important to see here that fundamentalism as a term starts out as a term referring to 20th century American conservative Protestantism. So that's an important distinction here, that it is a Christian term that eventually gets used more broadly, and largely because there's a lot of similarity between fundamentalist types of groups and how they see the world and how they see sources of authority. So it makes sense that fundamentalism would be a term that would be used. But anyway, specifically focusing on the focus here of American Christian 20th century Protestantism, fundamentalism. So in the early 20th century, there is this attempt to try and lay out or sketch out the contours of what it means to be a Christian. Because for a fundamentalist, Christians are those that believe in the things there on screen, the inerrancy of Scripture, the virgin birth, substitutionary atonement. Remember, a substitutionary atonement refers to the idea that Jesus' death served as a substitute for the death of human beings. Fourth, the bodily resurrection, both of Jesus and the hope of bodily resurrection for human beings. And it's the authenticity of miracles. And especially within Presbyterianism, but then later throughout a lot of conservative Christian groups, these 5 points become a standard by which one's Christian identity is measured. If you agree, from the fundamentalist side, if you agree with these things, then you are Christian. If you do not agree with any of them, then you are not a Christian. You're a modernist, you're a liberal, other terms that could be used to apply to this group. So these become a dividing line and become a test of orthodoxy. And so on one hand you have these 5 points. Another piece that's fitting into here in the creation of fundamentalism is a journal known as Fundamentals, financed by Sun Oil. And so one of the things that you would see throughout the history of fundamentalism, if we had more time to talk about it, was the amount of money that was poured into it by a variety of particularly oil magnates like Sun Oil, J. Howard Pugh, another oil baron who helps fund a variety of fundamentalist causes. But anyway, the Fundamentals was a journal of 12 volumes consisting of about 93 articles. And the focus of the articles was largely to respond to higher criticism. It was to respond to other liberal theologies, as well as Darwinism. And a lot of the people that wrote for the Fundamentals were people with advanced degrees, whether that be a PhD or an MD or some other type of degree. They were individuals of some intellectual weight. So we're not talking, today we have a very negative view of fundamentalism, and even for us who are conservative Christians, and I mean that conservative theologically, fundamentalism still is a term that is not in favor, because largely fundamentalism means moral, it means anti-intellectual, it means all sorts of negative connotations. But as it begins, that's not who the fundamentalists were. The fundamentalists, a lot of them were northern, urban, and of course, as we see in the fundamentals, a lot of people were, not anti-intellectual, certainly. They disagreed with, some hypotheses in science and those kind of things, but they were intellectuals. So there's a transition that takes place in around 1920, where there's this transition to Southerners being more prominent in fundamentalism. And we'll talk about all of this in a little bit, but what it starts, fundamentalism is predominantly not a Southern rural phenomenon. But it's also important to see here that fundamentalism is a very broad movement. It is not, it's not focused on one particular denomination. It is not developing as a separate denomination. Now later there will be fundamentalist denominations that kind of divide off here. But as fundamentalism starts, it starts within these religious groups and these religious churches. And in many respects, that's important to see because there's this struggle that takes place. Same kind of thing that we saw, or we will see in Restoration movement, of when you have these two opposing forces, this modernist liberal force, this conservative traditionalist force, they are struggling for the institutions. Right? The church buildings, they are struggling for colleges, and this is kind of a back and forth, and a question as to which group is going to end up determining the destiny of this denomination, a college, other types of institutions. Furthermore, unlike a lot of other movements we could see in American Christianity, there isn't a single dominant leader, someone who's really pushing this. Instead, it's a very diffuse type of authority with people from all sorts of positions, encouraging this, kind of working together, but there's not like one specific person who is the head of all this and pushing all this, like what we see with other religious movements. For a a while in the early 1900s, it appeared that fundamentalism was going to have a great success in its development. They were making some strides in taking over churches, taking over denominational boards, some colleges, but there was a general push where fundamentalism seemed to be on the rise. So much so that a liberal Protestant named Harry Anderson Fosdick preaches a sermon in 1922 with the title, "Shall the Fundamentalists Win?" expressing a lot of concern that fundamentalism is on the rise, that it is going to win the day, and that this was a negative thing for Fosdick. So on one hand, you have that, this general concern among liberal Protestants that fundamentalism is developing. Another expression of how fundamentalism was winning in those early decades of the 20th century was the success that they were having on prohibition. Now, temperance, this attempt to try and encourage people to not drink alcohol, trying to limit the sale and production of alcohol, had been a 19th century concern, but in the 20th century it became much more of a political activity to try and legally end the production of alcohol. Prior to this point, a lot of the focus had been on kind of societal pressure, providing alternatives, etc. But now in the 19th century, there is this effort to try and eliminate the production and sale of alcohol, which they were able to do. In the 1920s, the 18th Amendment to the Constitution was passed, which prohibited the sale and production of alcohol. Now, that's of course where you see the rise of bootlegging and speakeasies and all those other kind of things that were attempts to get around all of this. But in those early years of the 1920s, it seemed like the fundamentalists were winning because they had successfully, managed to get an amendment passed that shaped the morality, or was supposed to shape the morality of the United States. Fundamentalism, however, began to meet its downfall when it decided to take on evolution, specifically related to evolution in the public schools. Now, fundamentalists have largely been anti-evolution from the time that evolution really started to, at least Darwin's form of evolution, really started to take off. And a lot of conservative evangelicals, I think, rightly saw that if you take Darwin, it was going to lead to an increase in skepticism, that there wasn't a good way to unite Darwin's views on evolution with Christianity, and in such a way that both were actually kind of co-equal. Often what happened on the liberal Protestant side was that the realm of science kind of shaped how Christianity should be understood. It was shaping the Bible versus this kind of co-equal presentation. And kind of the main flashpoint for this downfall was the Scopes trial in 1925. In the state of Tennessee, one of the pieces of legislation that was passed that was similar as legislation was passed in other states was the Butler Act, named after the legislator that put it forward. Essentially, the Butler Act made it illegal to teach evolution in public schools. Well, once that was put forward, the ACLU and other organizations, other people, looked for ways to challenge that law in Tennessee and overturn it. Well, in the little town of Dayton, Tennessee, an individual was finally discovered who was willing to suggest that he had taught evolution in a public school classroom there in Dayton, Tennessee. The ACLU essentially had promised that they were going to help anybody that was willing to admit that they broke the Butler Act. Now, it's really unclear what happened, but this man, John Scopes, put himself forward as the test case in all of this. Scopes was the football coach, but he sometimes substituted as a teacher in biology. So, first of all, he's not the regular biology teacher. Additionally, there is a question of whether he actually ever taught evolution in public schools, or simply in the Dayton school, or simply provided some handouts or some classroom materials that talk about evolution. So it's unclear exactly what Scopes had done to break the Butler Act, but that wasn't the point. The point was he was willing to, claim that he had, and that was good enough. Well, this tiny little town suddenly became the focal point of a lot of attention in the 20th century United States. At one point, the ACLU and some of Scopes' friends, who were lawyers in Dayton, tried to get H.G. Wells, the science fiction author, well, he's more known for science fiction, he was also a lawyer. They tried to get him to come down and defend Scopes. He was unable to do so, and so they got a man named Clarence Darrow. Darrow was well known in the United States because he was an agnostic, but he was also well known for a trial that he had participated in of two teenagers named Leopold and Loeb, who had kind of, they were accused of murdering a 14-year-old boy. And essentially, they had confessed to the crime, but Darrow argued that there was a mental disease or mental disorder that both of these teenagers suffered from. It's kind of the first time that that's really offered as a defense. And so they ended up being sentenced to life in prison as opposed to receiving the death penalty. Darrow had been involved in a wide variety of other causes as well, labor unions, other types of things. Evidently, though, was very hard to work with, and so there wasn't, once he kind of signed on board, there wasn't a lot of other interest of people trying to help him. So on the defense side, Clarence Darrow served as the defense attorney for Scopes. On the prosecuting side, eventually a man named William Jennings Bryan came to the head as the lead prosecutor in this. Bryan was a very well-known politician. He had served as Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He had tried 3 times to be nominated as the Democratic presidential candidate. He was unsuccessful in all 3 elections. But he was also well known as a fundamentalist who had gone all over the country speaking on fundamentalism, other types of things. So you have these 2 very well-known lawyers, this case about evolution, and it really was the trial of the century. Media came from all over the place to sit in on the trial, listen to the trial, report back. People crowded around on the grounds. It was a circus, really, that was all a part of this. Ultimately, Scopes was found guilty, and he was fined $100. However, that was later overturned on appeal because of a technicality. Scopes had been tried simply before a judge and not a jury. And according to Tennessee law, no fine over $50 could be assigned without a jury trial. And so the judge, by assigning a $100 fine, had actually, set up a case for appeal. So eventually Scopes won on appeal. A lot of the focus of Darrow's defense was not so much on claiming that Scopes was innocent of breaking the Butler Act, but he attempted to try and focus the attention on whether or not evolution was true. And so he had a variety of experts that he wanted to bring in and have them take the stand that were Christians who believed in evolution, some of them scientists, and essentially tried to discredit the whole idea of the Butler Act to begin with. Well, the judge essentially ruled against him, saying that's not what the case is about. The case is not about whether or not evolution is true. The case is about whether or not John Scopes has broken the Butler Act. And so a lot of Darrow's defense was frustrated. At one point, though, it was very strange to begin with, but at one point, though, Clarence Darrow, the defense attorney, called William Jennings Bryan, the prosecuting attorney, to the stand as an expert witness on Christianity, and essentially made a fool out of him, asking him a bunch of questions that Bryan found very difficult. A lot of them, the traditional village atheist type of questions. Where did Cain get his wife? Things like that. What particularly was interesting out of all of this is that he managed to get Bryan to admit on the stand that the days of Genesis 1, in Bryan's estimation, did not have to be literal 24-hour days. And so that in itself kind of was a very interesting point for him to get over this fundamentalist. Like I said, it still ended up with Scopes being found guilty.
Hold on. I'm sorry, I know I can't remember. The Scopes trial, kind of break that down for me, because I know I heard this before.
So essentially it's about, there was a law against teaching evolution in public schools. And so essentially, this guy named John Scopes.
He's the one that started it all, I think.
Well, he's kind of the one that claimed that he had taught evolution and tried to, it was essentially people were trying to get the Butler Act overturned, which said you couldn't teach evolution in public schools.
God.
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
So not only was the Scopes trial a big issue about that, but essentially it was painted as this great conflict between science and religion, urban society versus rural society. So, all these urban newspapers, Chicago, Baltimore, New York, sent reporters to this tiny little town in Tennessee and essentially painted it as, oh, can you believe what these people in backwoods Tennessee actually believe? And so it became about people in urban centers versus rural centers. Of course, a lot of it was also north and south. A lot of the sectionalism still facing the country there as well, even in the 1920s.
Yeah, an interesting question for you.
Sure.
How do you believe? Well, okay, let me just ask you. How do you believe evolution grew so strong and got such a big rise? Because in our books we have the dinosaurs and blah, blah, millions and billions of years ago. How long has that been going on, and did this really influence that?
Well, it certainly opened the door for evolution to gain more of a standing. The big thing is that by the end of the 19th century, a lot of scientists had accepted Darwin's view of evolution.
So it was already...
it was accepted pretty rapidly.
It was already in the books, right?
Yeah, in some places. There were some states that tried to, like Tennessee, that tried to pass laws against it. With the rise of science as a field of authority that people respected, that had a profound effect on us. Modern science up to the 19th century wasn't hugely significant. But if you have industrialization, a variety of the technological developments, even though they pale in comparison to what we can do today. They were fantastic at the time. You know, and so all those things made science and progress, you know, those kind of things is, you know, these are important fields of knowledge. So, yeah, I think that's the role that science itself as a field came to play. Had a lot to do with that transition. Largely, though, the Scopes trial, at least for our purposes, was the foundation for the decrease of fundamentalism. And so, as after Scopes, fundamentalism became a very broad term that could be used for a variety of things. We already mentioned how we have fundamentalism used to refer to groups within Islam, even Judaism and Hinduism. So the term itself becomes a very broad term, removed away from those specific 20th century conservative American Protestants. It also becomes a term that is associated with rural culture, even though, as I said, up to the 1920s, a lot of fundamentalists were largely from the north and from urban centers. A lot of people began to say, well, fundamentalism refers to people in the backwoods, people that live on the farms, people that don't live in the cities. Even though that wasn't specifically accurate, eventually becomes more accurate, where fundamentalism is more of a rural phenomenon than an urban phenomenon. But in the 1920s it wasn't. It was more urban. Fundamentalism becomes equated with anti-intellectualism. And then finally it also becomes a pejorative. As a term, to call somebody fundamentalist is not to compliment them. And there aren't too many people in the past 3 or 4 decades who have willfully taken on the label fundamentalist. There are a few that would be proud to say, I'm a fundamentalist, but most people would rather not have that name applied to them. Well, because of all of these things taking place out of the Scopes trial, fundamentalism, which had been so particularly interested in trying to shape American culture, largely begins to retreat from American culture. Looking at the Scopes trial, its failures there, and then while they had achieved success with prohibition, the passing of the 18th Amendment of the Constitution, the 21st Amendment was passed in just a short amount of time, which overturned the 18th Amendment, so it now made it legal to produce and sell alcohol. So there was another way that fundamentalists were losing. They were losing in the colleges, they were losing in these denominations that they were trying to take over. And so a lot of fundamentalists decided to kind of retreat and go underground. Where before a lot of fundamentalists had been focused on trying to make these large, grand changes in American culture, in the 1930s and even into the 1940s, most fundamentalists tended to be more focused on local, independent types of efforts. And so it was not as much about trying to make these grand changes to society as it was about the city or region where you tried to live. There was much more independence instead of these collective types of movements. You also see, these fundamentalists retreating from churches, starting new denominations, but then also starting new educational systems. A variety of Bible schools and institutes developed in the 1930s and 40s that were essentially alternatives to the traditional seminaries of Protestant. So, for example, in Princeton, Princeton Theological Seminary had been a very prominent seminary, educational institution, but gradually a lot of the professors there took on more liberal theological types of convictions, about the inspiration of the Bible, those kind of things. So that led a lot of the more conservative individuals to leave and start Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. So you have that kind of movement. But then you also have a variety of just these Bible schools or institutes where largely the focus was the training of ministers. Other people could come and study the Bible, but the focus was training ministers to preach the Word, defend traditional fundamentalist views, and those kind of things. Now, many of those Bible schools have eventually morphed into other institutions. They started off as these kind of 2-year schools, preacher training, separate and apart from the educational system in the United States. But they moved into 4-year institutions, started offering a variety of degrees, sought accreditation from the United States government, the Department of Education. Some of them have gone into universities. So there's a lot of those schools that started off as trying to be separate from culture that are now, fairly well respected or fairly prominent educational institutions. Other people turn to other options for spreading the message. Radio in the 1920s and 30s, of course, is just coming into its prime. And so a lot of fundamentalists tried to get on the radio, either by purchasing time or sometimes buying radio stations outright, all in an effort to try to send their message through the airwaves, particularly because a lot of other religious groups, non-fundamentalists, and even non-Christians, Catholic, Protestant, all sorts of groups were on the radio with radio programs. Some of those radio programs were simply just the broadcast of a church's services. Right? So Sunday morning, you're listening live to the service. Other times, it was just the minister giving a message. Right? He's in a booth somewhere, just talking into a microphone. Some of them became very popular ministers. The one that's pictured on the slide is a man named Charles Fuller. His old-fashioned revival hour becomes very popular across the country. Other people did as well, but radio becomes very successful for fundamentalists. And of course, as TV will eventually start developing, fundamentalists will use that to great effect as well. Largely, the focus, of course, is trying to distance fundamentalism from liberal Christianity. So, the radio, Bible schools, other types of things like church camps, retreats, all of these are to try and provide opportunities for Christians to, or fundamentalists really, to be educated, to study the Bible, to spend time with other fundamentalists, and not be influenced as much by liberal Christianity. And a lot of fundamentalists were also trying to be separate from American culture. They didn't particularly think that American culture in general was very hospitable, looked at it as going in the wrong direction, and so there was the goal of separating from not just liberal Christianity, but American culture as well. And so a lot of fundamentalists, though certainly not all, became very apolitical, decided not to vote, not to be involved in political causes. There were still some fundamentalists, however, who were very active in politics. People, particularly against communism. That produces a real development in fundamentalism. A lot of people very anti-communist, supportive of anti-communist attempts, trying to rid communists out of the United States, etc. In many respects, that kind of sets the stage now for where we're going, which is kind of going back now and looking at the Restoration movement and how that's fitting into all of this. And particularly, I'm going to focus on churches of Christ at this point and the premillennial conflict that develops in the early 20th century. Now remember, the split that's taking place since the post-Civil War period between churches of Christ and disciples of Christ is often splitting along the same type of lines. They are splitting on sectional lines, north-south. They are splitting urban-rural. They are splitting, this conservative liberal theology. And while I would hesitate to call churches of Christ fundamentalists in the early 20th century, there are a lot of ways that there are parallels. And one particular issue, of course, has to do with, excuse me, this idea about premillennialism and the end times. Now, premillennialism fits into a larger development of interest in eschatology in the 19th century and into the 20th century. We've talked about this before, highlighted this before, but when thinking about the end times, which is what eschatology refers to, end times things, most Christian groups in the 19th century were either post-millennial or premillennial. Remember, the post-millennial largely had an optimistic view of human society, that society is going to get better and better through human effort, and so you have post-millennialists creating all these institutions, reform groups, societies, all with the hope that they are going to reform society to the point where the kingdom of God is going to arrive, and after 1,000 years or after the millennium, Jesus is going to return. So Jesus' return would be post-millennium, or after the millennium. And Alexander Campbell was one of those who was post-millennial. And often, for Campbell, the main thing that he believed was going to bring about the millennium was the restoration of ancient Christianity, the restoration of the ancient order of things. And so that was his predominant focus. A lot of other people were premillennial, meaning that they believed that Jesus was going to return before the millennium, so pre-millennial. Largely, these people tended to be more pessimistic about human nature, believing that ultimately, while some strides could be made, human society was not going to radically change, radically get better until Jesus' return. So those are the basic positions when it comes to the end times in the 19th century. But throughout the 19th century, premillennialism eventually begins to get a hold. Excuse me. While postmillennialism had largely been very prominent, premillennialism becomes more prominent throughout the 19th century. One expression of this is the work of a man named William Miller. Miller was born at the end of the 18th century and was largely an uneducated farmer. He would later say that his religious outlook was predominantly deist. And by deist, he meant that he believed there was a God, but that God wasn't active in human life. He kind of started the universe, wound it up like a clockmaker would wind a clock, set it on the mantle, and walked away. So that's largely how a lot of deists looked at the universe and God. They believed God. They felt that, or they believed in God. They felt that you couldn't explain where the universe came from without a divine being. But they didn't really believe in God's activity in the world. And specifically, a rejection of Jesus being the Son of God in any sort of divine way. Although they did find Jesus' moral vision to be very useful, very reasonable. So here's Miller as a deist who ends up fighting in the War of 1812, has a conversion experience. He decides that deism is no longer true. He believes that God is living, is active, and so he becomes a Baptist. And having become a Baptist, he's very interested in studying Scripture, excuse me, and begins teaching himself about Scripture. He really finds the most interest in the prophetic books of Daniel and Revelation. And he believes that these books provide information that is accessible to the common person. And he believed that anybody could understand the messages of Daniel and Revelation if they put in enough effort. But he believes that within these texts, he has determined through a series of calculations when Jesus is going to return.
People do that now.
Yeah. Yeah. And so around the year 1818, Miller becomes convinced that he has determined when Jesus is going to return. But evidently really doesn't talk too much about it. It's not really a centerpiece of a lot of his conversations. Along the way, he becomes a Baptist minister as well. So he's preaching, but again, the calculations aren't the main point. But eventually, some people begin to learn of this, and people start becoming very interested in it. He gathers a following. It really grows to the size where it can almost have become a new denomination. And a lot of it becomes focused around these calculations. So Miller essentially said that Jesus was going to return sometime between March 21st, 1843 and March 21st, 1844. Clue in, spoil it a little bit, Jesus did not return. That's not why. So where did he get the date? Well, he looked at a couple passages in Daniel and believed that in Daniel could be found things that would indicate when Jesus returned. So one of the passages that he looked at, or particularly found useful, was Daniel 8:14. In Daniel 8:14, it talks about there being 2,300 days before the sanctuary was going to be cleansed. Well, as he studied it, he believed that the sanctuary being cleansed referred to the earth, and so the sanctuary referred to the earth, and the cleansing referred to the second coming. So the cleansing of the earth, the cleansing of the sanctuary, would be Jesus' return. He's also looking at Daniel chapter 9, which says that there would be 70 weeks before the Messiah would arrive. So, that there would be 70 weeks from the rebuilding of Jerusalem to the arrival of the Messiah. Well, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, he dated to 467 BCE, because of Artaxerxes' command to Ezra, the scribe, the priest, to rebuild Jerusalem. But the Messiah referred to Jesus, and 70 weeks would only be a little bit over a year and a half, or a little bit less than a year and a half. So a week could not refer to a week, but if a day of those weeks referred to a year, that would mean the 70 weeks was actually 490 years, and so from the rebuilding of Jerusalem to the arrival of Jesus was 490 years. And a lot of people have interpreted Daniel chapter 9 that way. So, if in Daniel 9 a day referred to a year, then in Daniel chapter 8 verse 14, Miller felt a day referred to a year. So it said 2,300 days, but it meant 2,300 years. So, The rebuilding of Jerusalem becomes the date to use, so 2,300 years minus 457 BC equals 1843. Now, there's no year zero, so Miller was hedging his bets a little and saying somewhere between 1843 and 1844. He uses March 21st because that is the Jewish priestly calendar of that year. So somewhere in that Jewish year of 1843 to 1844. Like I said, a lot of people are following his views. The movement grows in New York, in New England, it's in Ohio, it's in Washington, D.C. It becomes very, very big. But, of course, March 21st, 1844 passes and nothing has taken place. Evidently, there had been some people who had quit their jobs, who had sold their homes, all in anticipation of this event. Well, Miller is just stunned because he looks at his math again and his math works out. Now, of course, he's basing it on the assumption of what Daniel 8:14 means. I don't believe Daniel 8:14 has anything to do with the earth, but it has to do with the temple being cleansed in the Maccabean revolt. But anyway, but he's looking at it, he just can't understand. And you would think that the movement would completely crumble, but there are some people that aren't convinced that that Miller is totally wrong in all of this. So, some of the people in the Millerites, let's call them, come to believe that what's happened is Miller is off on the day. The day should have been Yom Kippur of 1844. Now, there is a difference in 1844 between when most Jews dated Yom Kippur and this tiny little group of Jews, this minority group of Jews who dated Yom Kippur as October 22nd, 1844. So, that's the new date. At first, Miller isn't convinced by this, but the more he looks into it, the more he talks with this group that's convinced that this has happened, he becomes convinced that October 22nd, 1844 is the time. The aftermath of this has been referred to as the Great Disappointment, because it was. Evidently, it was either the first time or the second time. People were, they sold their homes, so they quit their jobs, that kind of stuff. Had even gone into hilltops dressed in white, waiting for Jesus to return on October 22nd. Well, Miller kind of gives up the whole thing. He still believes that the return of Christ is very soon to be, but he kind of retreats from public life. However, not everybody totally gives up on Miller's views. In fact, there's a group of his followers who become convinced that he had the right date and that some things happened. He was just wrong about what was going to happen and where it was going to happen. The sanctuary cleansing, they claimed, was not something to do with earth, but something that took place in heaven. And so the claim was that from the time of his ascension until 1844, Jesus had been pleading for the forgiveness of human beings' sins. But in 1844, that had finally been completed, and now he was officially becoming the high priest and was actually now going about the work of forgiving the sins. So he'd been pleading for the forgiveness, but now is actually forgiving people's sins.
If you put that on your face test and they would have in heels dressed in white, I remember that.
Yeah. So this group believes something happened on that day. They just believe it happened in heaven, not on earth. They connected it with a belief in continuing revelation, and so they claimed that there were some among their number, particularly a woman named Ellen White, who continued to receive revelations from God. And they also connected to it a Sabbatarianism, which is worship on Saturday, the Sabbath. So they were Seventh-day Adventists. Right, so this is the Seventh-day Adventism comes out of the aftermath of this Millerite group. Of course, also important for the Seventh-day Adventists were a lot of health concerns, hygiene issues, particularly food. So they become very active in healthcare. There are several hospitals across the country. I know there's several in Florida owned by Seventh-day Adventists or the Seventh-day Adventist Church. One of the first places that they start is the Western Health Institute in Battle Creek, Michigan. And one of the doctors there, I mean, a lot of people that come there are interested in health, but they're uneducated, they don't have advanced degrees, that kind of thing. But one of the doctors at the Western Health Reform Institute is really interested in trying to develop an alternative, a breakfast alternative to bacon and eggs, because a lot of the Adventists are trying to follow the laws of Leviticus, the laws about clean and unclean animals, and so they aren't going to eat bacon, so what's an alternative for breakfast food? And so this medical doctor decides that he's going to take cooked grains and make them into dry flakes.
That's the Kellogg.
Yeah, the doctor's name was John Harvey Kellogg. Now his brother, William Kellogg, will kind of take this and run with it. He'll be the one to kind of take this and make it into the breakfast cereal empire. So does one of Kellogg's patients, a man named C.W. Post. So both Post cereal and Kellogg cereal start out of this millennial expectation, right? I mean, it's all kind of out of this Millerite group that turns into Seventh-day Adventism and turns into cereal.
And the session was called Post cereal.
Well, I mean, it's the guy that starts Post cereal, and this Kellogg cereal. And this is
Post cereal still a problem?
There's some. Grape Nuts, I think, is Post. There's not a lot compared to like General Mills or Kellogg's. Now, I don't know. I'm not positive that they still have a connection to Seventh-day Adventism. They may have been sold off. That frequently happens with companies, right? They get sold off, but they keep the name.
So just right quick, the seventh day Adventists, they merge out of.
They come out of the Great Disappointment.
The Great Disappointment,
right? So it's this group that kind of thinks, okay, he's right about the time, he's just wrong about what happened. Right? So instead of, the large group just kind of, he tricked us, we were fooled, But then there's this other group that becomes Seventh-day Adventism that's committed to, he was right about the time, he was just wrong about where.
Okay, and then the cereal connection in Battle Creek, that came as a result of the Great Disappointment too?
Well, no, the Seventh-day Adventist concern with health and hygiene. So, in trying to find a breakfast alternative other than the unclean food of pig, they developed cereal.
But this is, like you said, it's a bit of a diet for biz for
Yeah.
I got you.
So Miller, in his calculations, become very prominent as a type of premillennialism in the 19th century. That becomes very, even though Miller dies in obscurity, it had a profound impact for quite some time, even on other people, even some people in the Restoration movement. We talked about Walter Scott, and we'll mention him again in a little bit. He's one that's influenced by by Miller's calculations. Another premillennialist group developing around the same time is a group sometimes referred to as the Russellites. That's not the name that they used. It comes from the name from the man named Charles Taze Russell. Russell is born in 1852 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Grows up in a wealthy Presbyterian household, but eventually he kind of becomes dissatisfied with Presbyterianism. largely because, like Miller, Russell becomes very interested in prophetic literature. And so he too begins studying prophecy, and even at an early age, he's 18 when he starts gathering people together for Bible studies based on some of the things that he believes he's discovered about prophetic literature. Now, this group, like the Millerites, really isn't starting off as a new denomination. It's meant to just be, people are just kind of, it's a Bible study. So they refer to themselves as Bible students. A lot of people afterwards would refer to them as the Russellites, people outside, because they're following the beliefs of this guy named Russell. Russell, like Miller, is very interested in the second coming of Christ, believes, like Miller, it's going to be a premillennial coming where Jesus is going to come first and then the mourning will take place. And like Miller, tries to put a date on it. Now his date, because he's born after Miller has already died, his date is 1878, which comes and goes without the second coming, just in case you were wondering. He dates it again to 1914. It came and went. But there is, once again, this kind of reinterpretation of Jesus has done something in 1914, but it wasn't what was originally expected. The group that continues out of this would later try to give other dates. 1975 was kind of like the last big date that they used as for the second coming. Since then, they've not really made public any sort of dates. So the second coming was a big thing for Russell, as well as his belief that from the time of Jesus to the end of time, there would be 144,000 people who would be part of the church that would live in heaven with Jesus at the end of time. And so this was a very special class. Of course, this number coming from Revelation chapter 7. But is, again, a very elect group. Even in the late 19th century, Russell said, well, the number's pretty well complete, but the possibility exists that some of those living members of the 144,000 could, deny the faith and lose their spot, and so other people could possibly join. If you weren't part of the 144,000, though, you could still be part of the great, what was called the Great Company, also coming from Revelation chapter 7, that would live on a reconstructed earth at the end of time. There wasn't a notion within the group, or has there been since this point, of an eternal hell. Instead, the wicked would be annihilated, would cease to exist. Russell's views become popular. Eventually, the group kind of starts moving from being a Bible students in denominations to being a separate group. There really isn't a lot of institutionalization during Russell's life. He does create a publishing organization called Zion's Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, but that's really the only kind of institutionalism that's part of this. Eventually, Russell would die off. Leadership would pass to a man named Joseph Rutherford. Rutherford would bring about a variety of other changes, including giving the Bible students a new name, and it's the name that they're more well known by, the Jehovah's Witnesses. But that's not until the 1930s, when that becomes the official name of the group. So instead, a lot of people called them Russellites, because there wasn't that notion of Jehovah's Witnesses. So you have Miller and his calculations, you have Russell and his calculations, so there's a lot of premillennialism going on here in this time period. After the Civil War, fewer people were post-millennial than before the Civil War, largely because of the amounts of violence and death that took place in the Civil War, kind of really made people question whether humanity was getting better. Right? When you see the kind of things that, you know, fellow country people are doing to each other.
I got close up for a minute. Miller was also very close up.
Premillennialists. They were premillennialists. A lot of other Christians were post-millennialists, but they are premillennialists.
You say after the Civil War.
After the Civil War, a lot fewer were post-millennial. So you have a lot more people that are premillennial.
Okay. Post-Civil War.
Yeah, post-Civil War. And then really after the First World War, World War I, after that time period, post-millennialism really declined. There are hardly any people after that point that are post-millennial. Most people, most Christians, most Protestants, become very pessimistic about human society because of the. Here's this. I mean, the Civil War was tragic enough, but then you have even worse, the violence of the First World War. So most Christians become more premillennial. Now, I do want to mention that within the Restoration movement, you see the rise of amillennialism. And that also shows up in liberal Protestantism and others. Amillennialism largely was a belief that the millennium of Revelation chapter 20 did not refer to a literal physical kingdom of Christ on earth, but instead was symbolic. So they did not believe a millennium was going to take place on earth. And so there are other groups that look at the millennium as something figurative, and that's where a lot of people eventually go in churches of Christ, at least in the later part of the 20th century. But a lot of liberal Protestants are that way as well. As I mentioned, a lot of people in the early Restoration movement tended to be post-millennial, people like Campbell and others, but there were a few people that were premillennial in the Restoration movement. Barton W. Stone, for example, and we talked a little bit about this in previous classes, appears to have been premillennial. He had a pessimistic view of human beings being able to change society, but he still believed people should. Right? So he was active in abolitionism, as we talked about. He also encouraged people to try and bring about Christian unity. So, even though Stone's premillennial, he's not as pessimistic as a lot of other people were. But connected with Stone as well was a belief in the separatism that needed to exist of people from society, not being involved in politics, other things like that, which we've talked about before. And that line continues through like David Lipscomb and some others. But ultimately, Stone tended to be very doubtful or pessimistic about human nature. Walter Scott was another person that, for a time, was premillennial. Evidently, William Miller's calculations were very convincing to Walter Scott, but once his calculations failed, once we got past 1844, Scott kind of drops the premillennialism and becomes more of a postmillennialist again. After Stone, on the conservative southern side of the Restoration movement, there were some who believed in premillennialism. There were others who looked at the kingdom more in metaphorical terms, or the coming of the kingdom in more spiritual terms than physical terms, but they still believed in the imminent return of Christ, like David Lipscomb, for example. He doesn't appear like he's completely premillennial, but he does believe Christ is soon going to return, we need to be separate from society, those kind of things. After the Civil War, a lot of the conservatives, the traditional side that is becoming the more the churches of Christ, they tended to adopt Campbell's view of the progression of human society. So they tended to be rather optimistic about human society, even though they didn't follow all the things that Campbell was saying later in his life that was becoming more liberal. But a lot of churches of Christ, up through the First World War, tended to follow the Stone Lipscomb view of staying separate from society, being pacifists, not being involved in government, those kind of things. So they got the Campbell view of the improvement of society, and they got the we need to be separate from society. After the First World War, though, especially as you get close to the Second World War, there's a transition where a lot of the churches of Christ, members of the churches of Christ, drop their pacifism, become very patriotic, especially after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, very vocal in support of the United States war effort. And that might be partly due to, an attack on American soil, as well as how a lot of people in the First World War and the Second World War looked suspiciously upon anybody who wasn't supportive. Right? So if you weren't patriotic out there and supporting the war effort, then you were actually aiding the enemy. Even if you weren't in support of the Germans, it was like you were. So, you have this switch. Additionally, in the 20th century, more and more emphasis was placed in churches of Christ that when the scriptures referred to the kingdom of God, they were referring to the church. So that the terms kingdom of God and church were equivalent. They both, so when Jesus referred to the kingdom of God, he was referring to the church. When Paul referred to the church, he was referring to the kingdom of God. And so the kingdom wasn't something that they were looking forward to. It was something that was already present and active. And said that those Christians waiting for Christ to return to establish a kingdom were misinterpreting the messianic prophecies. That Christ was successful and had established his kingdom, and that was reflected in the church. A lot of other Christians who were premillennial believed that the church was kind of a temporary measure, right? That Jesus was actually unsuccessful in establishing the kingdom of God, and so he established the church as a temporary measure before his final return, which would bring about the kingdom of God. So there's this difference on what the kingdom is between churches of Christ and some other Christian groups. Out of this, of course, both the premillennial view and a view that looked at the imminent return of Christ led to a lot of evangelism. And this becomes especially true even in fundamentalism as well. There are a lot of fundamentalists, as they retreat from culture, become very evangelistic. If Jesus' return is soon, they believed, why be so involved in changing society and all these other types of things to reform society when that's not going to take place until Jesus returns? So instead, focus on converting people. Right? And so a lot of effort was put into converting people rather than trying to address social issues. These differences over viewing society, how a Christian should respond to society, how you viewed the end times, all of these things came to a head in a big conflict in the 20th century over premillennialism in the churches of Christ. Some people continue to follow the Stone Lipscomb view of being separate from society, having a pessimistic outlook on society, and there were some of those that were premillennialists. Others abandoned premillennialism because they associated it with the Russellites. And so even though you might, there were Christians before the Russellites who believed in premillennialism. And you could have been influenced by that strain. Barton W. Stone, who lived and died before Russell was even born. People still referred to you as Russellite if you were premillennial. So this controversy develops. And so this opposition side, the side that's opposed to premillennialism, wants to maintain a very strict separation from other denominations. And so they're looking at premillennialism as being connected to these other denominations, like the Russellites, and that they look at it as this is not true to the Bible, this is a denominational doctrine. The main flashpoint for all of this that comes to a head appears to be the teachings of a man named Robert Henry Bull. Bull was born to a Catholic family in Germany in the 19th century, comes to the United States in 1890. Eventually he finds work as a farmhand in Tennessee, and it's there where he comes in contact with the teachings of the Churches of Christ, is influenced by them, is baptized into the Churches of Christ. He will go on to attend Nashville Bible School, which had been started by David Lipscomb. At the time, the president of the school was a man named James Harding, who would be later well known for a different school, actually one in Arkansas versus one in Tennessee. Nashville Bible School would later serve as the foundation for what would later be Lipscomb University. So today it's known as Lipscomb University.
Where is this?
Nashville.
Nashville. Okay.
So Bull studies there, graduates, starts preaching in a variety of places, eventually settling down in Kentucky.
And what was it called before?
It was called Nashville Bible School.
Nashville Bible School. Okay.
So he settles down in Kentucky after preaching in a variety of places. And so he's preaching there. He's also writing frequently, writes for the Gospel Advocate, which Lipscomb was editing at the time. Yeah, it's still written today. And for a time, he's actually the front page editor. So he's very prominent in this. But he's writing about these premillennial views, and gradually people start to oppose him, and so he's forced out of the editorship in 1915. He goes to writing for another journal called Word and Work. It had been started in 1908 in New Orleans and had been focused on restoring primitive Christianity in the Gulf Coast region. So as far as Texas across to Alabama, etc. It had kind of remained with the Churches of Christ through the separation, condemned a lot of the things the disciples were doing, and began to support a premillennial outlook, even though the original manager was postmillennialist. He's kind of forced out and actually disfellowshipped by a local church in the area. And the paper is eventually sold to Bull. So he starts writing for it in 1916. He's very premillennial and would eventually accept the dispensational version of premillennialism that we talked about with fundamentalism. But finds himself opposed by a variety of individuals. One of the major early controversies is with a man named H. Leo Bowles, who is he's the president of David Lipscomb College at this point. So by this point in the debate, Lipscomb has passed on. They've renamed Nashville Bible School Lipscomb College, David Lipscomb College, and so they debate between each other. Bowles, I know their names are very similar. They spell differently, but when you say them, they sound almost very similar. So H. Leo Bowles took the position that it's very positive outlook on human potential. Human beings were getting better as they were shaped by the gospel, and to argue otherwise, that human beings were getting better with the spread of Christianity, Bowles felt was to argue that the church was a failure, which he felt Robert Bull was arguing. Bull, on the other hand, Robert Bull, on the other hand, argued that the only hope for Christians, the goal of Christians, was Jesus' return. And that's the thing that they should be focused on. We'll go ahead and stop there for today. We'll finish up after spring break with a little bit left about premillennialism, and then we'll talk about some other issues that are developing in other segments of the restoration movement.